Okay, we're going to begin lesson 38, something called the Phillips curve. And the nice thing about the Phillips curve is it's one of the more straightforward topics that we do here in macroeconomics because there really isn't anything particularly new to learn. This is all an illustration of things that we already know. And what we're talking about here is a graph. This graph was originally designed by a gentleman named William Phillips, and of course that's where it gets its name. And what the graph was illustrating was the trade-off between unemployment and inflation. What Phillips observed was that very often there was going to be, when you tried to attack one of those two things, let's say you were trying to deal with unemployment, it was a very strong likelihood that you were going to create inflation when you did that. And there's a lot of reasons why that generally turned out to be true. It wasn't always true, and he never claimed that it was always true. But he did claim that most of the time, when you tried to deal with one issue, you created a problem with the other. And because that's true, and that relationship he found to be so often the case, he decided to make a graph that represented that situation. And the graph looks something like this. This is called the Phillips curve. And what the Phillips curve was illustrating was the trade-off between here on the y-axis, inflation rate, again, that's a percentage, and the unemployment rate, a percentage. And these are the two things that we've been trying to fight as macroeconomists all year long, trying to address the problems of inflation and unemployment. Now, since Phillips said that there was a trade-off between those two things, what should the Phillips curve, actually look like? Well, it would make sense that if there's a trade-off between the two things, if they have a negative relationship, then his curve has a negative slope. And it in fact does. The Phillips curve has a downward slope. That is the Phillips curve, and more specifically, it's what's known as the short run Phillips curve. And again, what's his point? Suppose we pick a point on the Phillips curve where we have 2% inflation and 7% unemployment. If we try to cut unemployment down to 4%, we're going to create a rise in inflation, in this case to 6%. Now, the specific slope of the Phillips curve varies greatly depending on the economy that we're talking about. So this is not a general example. This is just a specific example that we pulled out here. But the point is, we're trying to illustrate the idea that if you reduce unemployment down here from 7 to 4%, you're going to drive up inflation in this specific example from 2 to 6%. Now, how do we put this into practical application, and why is it important? Well, Phillips was generally addressing this whole idea to policymakers who were trying to deal with unemployment and inflation. And what he noticed was that it had very different effects depending on whether or not you were talking about aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Since most of the time governments and central banks use aggregate demand to solve the problems of the economy, he generally made his curve fit aggregate demand. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's a situation where we're going to shift aggregate demand first. Here is an aggregate demand curve. In this case, we're going to say we have a low aggregate demand curve, one where perhaps we're in a recession. And in this example, what we're going to do is just throw a couple numbers in here. We're going to say a price level of 102. That's a CPI of 102. And we're going to say we have a GDP, or a quantity of output, of 7,500, and that's going to result in an unemployment rate of 7%. Now, we of course can graph that corresponding point over here on the Phillips curve. We have 2% inflation, as indicated by the 102 CPI, and 7% unemployment, which we've noted is concurrent with the 7,500 in output. Now again, let's be clear, 7,500 in GDP and 7% unemployment, they don't necessarily always match up. But for this example, that's just the numbers we've selected. Notice that I've labeled both points with a capital A. These are corresponding points. These points don't mean the same thing, but these are not side-by-side graphs for those who have done those in microeconomics. But what they do is correspond. So that A in the aggregate market graph, this one right here, relates to this A here in the Phillips curve. Now, let's suppose that we do what governments often do when they have low aggregate demand. Perhaps they increase spending and increase aggregate demand. Well, now we have a higher level of aggregate demand. And what, of course, do we know that does? That pushes prices up and it increases GDP, which decreases unemployment. So we've increased our price level from 102 to 106 CPI. So we probably went from 2 to 6% inflation rate. And down here, we've gone from 7,500 to 8,000 GDP, which in this example, we're saying reduced unemployment from 7 to 4%. All right, so we now have an inflation rate of 6% and an unemployment rate of 4%. Can we graph that corresponding point on a Phillips curve? Well, if we return to the Phillips curve, we see that we can. We've gone from 2 to 6% inflation and down from 7 to 4% unemployment. What you'll notice is that we've stayed on the Phillips curve because Phillips designed the curve with aggregate demand changes in mind. As aggregate demand increases to the right, we move along the Phillips curve from point A to point B to the left. So we slide up and to the left on the Phillips curve when aggregate demand increases. And really the Phillips curve is as simple as that. Now, the situation gets a little more complicated when we have a supply change. Again, we've taken a couple points here. We have P1 and Y1 with an A marked in the center. Now this time we're using generic prices and GDP, P1 and Y1. And over on the right, we have the Phillips curve marked with a point a random spot. Now, what do we know? If my supply curve shifts to the right, to the left, for whatever the reason might be, then what's going to happen is we're going to have a decrease in our GDP and an increase in price levels to point B. Now, because that's true, what do we know is happening? We know that our prices are rising, so inflation is rising, and we know our GDP is decreasing, so our unemployment is increasing. Now, if I take that situation and go back to the Phillips curve, what I'm going to notice is and the problem is that I have higher inflation and higher unemployment. If my aggregate supply curve shifts to the left, I have higher inflation caused by the higher price levels and higher unemployment caused by the lower quantity of GDP. The problem is the Phillips curve as we have it right now doesn't reflect that situation, because if I want to move, for example, from A here up and to the left, then yes, I'm increasing inflation, but I'm decreasing unemployment. If I move down on the Phillips curve from point A this way, well then yes, I'm increasing unemployment, but I'm decreasing inflation. I can't stay on the Phillips curve anymore. In fact, what I need is a new Phillips curve. Well, if my price and my unemployment are both increasing, the only way I can make that work is to shift my Phillips curve to the right. And you can see my point B now is actually on a brand new Phillips curve. The Phillips curve has shifted to the right. So what can we say about this? When we have a change in aggregate demand, we're going to move along the Phillips curve or move up and down the Phillips curve. When we have a change in aggregate supply, we're actually going to move the Phillips curve. In this example, if you shift the the aggregate supply curve to the left, you're going to increase the Phillips curve to the right. Okay, let's do a few examples and see how this works out. Let's start first with the idea of how an increase in government spending is reflected. Okay, we have here on the left our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, and on the right our Phillips curve graph. Now you can see I've already put in place a generic price level, P1, and a generic quantity of output, Q1, on the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. And on the Phillips curve graph, I've already included a corresponding inflation rate, this one here, which corresponds to the P1 over on our first graph, our aggregate graph, and a corresponding unemployment rate, which corresponds to the GDP of Q1. And I've labeled both A to show that these points correspond. All right, now we have an increase in government spending, If I draw in my aggregate demand curve, my first one here, of course, if I have an increase in government spending, that's going to increase aggregate demand. If we increase aggregate demand, that's going to increase prices and increase output, which is going to raise inflation and decrease unemployment to point B. Now, if I come over to my Phillips curve, if I'm raising inflation and decreasing unemployment, it looks like I'm going this way on the Phillips curve, to the left. There we go. To the left of my Phillips curve, we're sliding this way. Inflation is rising, unemployment is decreasing. And so I'll draw in a point B, and I'll mark it as inflation rate 2 and unemployment rate 2. Okay, let's look at a second example. In this case, we're going to illustrate how an increase in income taxes impacts the short-run Phillips curve. Again, we'll start with an aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph on the left and a Phillips curve graph on the right. We'll draw in our aggregate demand curve so we have an equilibrium point. We'll mark that equilibrium P1 and Q1. And of course, now there'll be a corresponding inflation rate tied to the price level P1 and a corresponding unemployment rate tied to the GDP Q1 over on the Phillips curve. And again, since we labeled the point A in our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, we'll also label it point A over on our Phillips curve graph, I1 and U1. Now we're talking about an increase in income taxes, and as a review, if we increase income taxes, that means that it makes it more difficult for people to have disposable income, so consumption and investment will decrease, which means aggregate demand will decrease. And because aggregate demand decreased, P1 and Q1 reduce both, but to P2 and Q2. And because P is decreasing, that means that inflation is decreasing. And because Q is decreasing, that means unemployment is increasing. So if I go over to my Phillips curve graph, if I'm now going to show an illustration of a decrease in inflation and an increase in unemployment, it looks like we could slide down to the right, and that would work pretty well. And in fact, that's what we'll do. We'll lower our inflation rate and increase our unemployment rate. Again, that's not a surprise because we know that on aggregate demand changes, the Phillips curve, we simply move up and down the Phillips curve. We don't actually move the Phillips curve. Let's move to a third example. Suppose there's an increase in fear about future inflation. Show the impact on the short-run Phillips curve. All right, this one you may want to pause for a moment and give a shot yourself, and then we'll come back and draw it together. Okay, so we're talking about an increase in fear about future inflation. Well, what do we have here? Again, I draw in two curves here. Our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph on the left and the Phillips curve on the right, just like we've been doing. We've already labeled our P1 and our Y1, and we have a corresponding point A, and we'll draw in now here our corresponding point. Now, we have a decrease in aggregate supply. You'll remember that if we have an increase in inflation fears, what tends to happen is people tend to ask for higher wages. And because that's true, the cost of production increases and aggregate supply decreases. That's all review. Now, what's important is this. Because aggregate supply has decreased, we know that prices are going to rise, and we know that our GDP is going to decrease, which means that inflation is going to rise and unemployment is going to rise. Now, if both of those things happen, we can no longer use our existing Phillips curve because the existing Phillips curve says those things have to move opposite directions. So if we've had a rise in inflation and a rise in unemployment, we have to actually move our Phillips curve, in this case, to the right. And there is our brand new short-run Phillips curve to the right. All right, well, the Phillips curve was not only a short-run Phillips curve, but it was also the long-run Phillips curve. And remember, the long-run Phillips curve is essentially a reflection of what Phillips noticed about the long run. And Phillips noticed the same thing that most economists notice about the long run. The long run is when all of our prices and wages adjust to equilibrium. So in that case, what we have always noticed is that as inflation rises, and we see a big long vertical Phillips curve here. As inflation rises, it has no impact on unemployment in the long run. You can see we're moving here up and down this inflation. No matter where the inflation rate is, we're not changing our natural rate of unemployment. And that shouldn't surprise anybody. So start by just getting an image of what the long run Phillips curve actually looks like, and we'll get into why that makes some sense. By the way, the graph has not changed. We have the inflation rate over here on the y-axis and the unemployment rate on the x-axis. And in fact, we could actually graph the short run Phillips curve and the long run Phillips curve together on the same graph without any trouble. Again, what does it tell us? If we have low inflation and inflation rises, it has no impact on unemployment. We've moved from A to B, inflation has risen, but unemployment has not changed, or the natural rate has not changed. Now, why does that make some sense? Let's take a quick look. Remember that in the long run, virtually all economists agree the aggregate supply curve is perfectly inelastic or perfectly vertical. So when we notice that fact, it really makes a lot of sense that the Phillips curve would also be perfectly vertical in the long run because, again, let's use the model to the left first. If I increase aggregate demand, I do something to increase aggregate demand. What I notice is that all I really do is drive prices up to point B in this case, to P2, now at our corresponding point B, but I have not changed the amount of GDP that I am producing. The GDP stays the same, and we've learned this all year. Because that's true, what Phillips noted was that when you increase aggregate demand in the long run, your inflation rises, but your natural rate of unemployment does not. Your inflation rose from inflation rate here to inflation rate here, but your unemployment rate did not change at all. That doesn't surprise anyone, I don't think, if you've been paying attention to what the long run actually looks like. Okay, we're going to finish this lesson by talking about the Phillips curve and what relationship it has to economic growth. And of course, that's been a big topic for this unit so far. You'll recall that we have a number of ways to illustrate economic growth. We could move the PPF curve out to the right. Another way is to move the aggregate supply curve to the right. And so here in our graph, on the left-hand graph, we have again an aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. And I've only drawn in this case the long-run aggregate supply curve because I want to illustrate a point. Again, remember that economic growth can be illustrated by a rightward shift of the long-run aggregate supply curve. So let's do that. There's our long-run aggregate supply curve moving to the right. And of course, the natural rate of unemployment, the natural rate of output has increased. We need to produce more things than we used to keep ourselves at full employment because we've experienced economic growth. Again, this is a bit of a review. However, there's a third way to illustrate economic growth, and that's using the Phillips curve. If the natural rate of output has increased, the full employment GDP is increasing from this natural rate to this natural rate, then what must be true? We must be using more of our resources to achieve full employment, which means the only way we can illustrate that here in the Phillips curve is to say that we need a lower rate of unemployment in order to achieve that full employment rate. And so the Phillips curve has to shift to the left. A leftward shift of the Phillips curve also illustrates economic growth. I should say a leftward shift of the long-run Phillips curve also illustrates economic growth. Because again, when we increase the aggregate supply curve, the long-run aggregate supply curve, we're increasing the amount of GDP we need to produce to be at full employment. So what that means is that we need to decrease the amount of unemployment we can have, which means the Phillips curve has to shift to the left. Okay, let's wrap up with a problem that you can try. This graph says to show, or this question says to show the impact of a decrease in corporate taxes on the short run Phillips curve. Now I've gotten you started by sort of outlining the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph on the left and the Phillips curve graph on the right. You go ahead and complete this graph and then we'll check the answers. Okay, so we have a decrease in corporate taxes. All right, that's interesting. So first thing we need to draw in is an aggregate supply curve. And of course, we're going to label our P1 and our Y1. And it's always a good idea with the Phillips curve to label a point, whatever letters you use. In this case, again, I'm using letter A to illustrate one point. We should now take that point and we should find a corresponding point over here on a Phillips curve. Of course, it doesn't really matter where it is as long as we know that that A in the Phillips curve corresponds to the P1 and Y1 from the aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph. Okay, now we have a decrease in corporate taxes. Remember that corporate taxes, according to the supply side economics, if you decrease them, you're going to decrease the cost of production, and so you're actually going to increase the short run supply curve. So if I do that, I have an increase in the short run supply curve that drives down prices and increases output. And if it's driving down prices, that means my inflation rate is decreasing. And if it's increasing output, that means my unemployment rate is decreasing. The only way that I can show a decrease in inflation and unemployment in the Phillips curve is to shift the Phillips curve to the left. So in this instance, actually in all instances, when we have an increase in aggregate supply, we're going to have a decrease to the left of the Phillips curve. That concludes our lesson. Please complete this module and then complete this lesson, and then lesson 39 will include more practice problems on the Phillips curve.